Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Real Queen Charlotte, Inside the Real Bridgerton Court, by Catherine Curzon. Narrated by Kim Bretton. Introduction. Charlotte is not tall, nor a beauty, pale and very thin, but looks sensible and is genteel. Her hair is darkish and fine, her forehead low, her nose very well, except the nostrils, spreading too wide. Her mouth has the same fault, but her teeth are good. She talks a good deal and French tolerably, possesses herself, is frank, but with great respect to the king. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was not born to greatness. She was quiet, unassuming, and raised in a little corner of Europe from which it seemed unlikely that any queen would emerge. Yet when it came to royal marriages, a mostly forgotten little corner might turn out to be just what was needed. When George II died in 1760, his son and heir Frederick was already dead. The crown passed to Fred's 22-year-old son, the timid, unassuming George III. He would reign for nearly 60 years. At his side, through thick and thin, was Queen Charlotte, the girl from Mecklenburg-Strelitz. What made Charlotte so remarkable was the very fact that she wasn't remarkable at all. Unpolitical, unambitious, and aspiring only to a happy home, she was a gift to the politicians who hoped to keep the young George III in check. At first, Charlotte got her wish. Though she had never met her groom before the wedding day, their marriage was loving, faithful, and mundane in its domesticity. There was not a trace of the tumultuous roller coaster of infidelity, divorce, and murder that had tainted the marriage of George I, nor of the politically ambitious queen and procession of mistresses who had held sway at the court of George II. George III was at pains to prove to his subjects that he was not so different to them. He strove to demonstrate his Englishness, downplayed his German ancestry, and shared his bride's love of home and hearth. It should have been a match made in heaven, but fate had other things in store. Queen Charlotte and King George III were married for nearly 60 years. Their union was blighted by the king's ill health, and, as his wife became more keeper than companion, she mourned for the man she had known and loved. That unassuming, optimistic girl was dragged into a life that she had little anticipated, where she fled in terror from her husband's rages, locked the bedroom door against him at night, and sought solace in her unhappy, cosseted daughters. As the royal family erupted into an all-out war between the queen and the eldest son who would be regent, what had once been a happy home became a battleground. Yet Queen Charlotte was more than the stand-by-your-man wife at the side of an ailing husband, or the gossip-hungry matriarch of the Bridgerton court. She lived through tumultuous times, and her journey from that little corner of Europe to queen of one of the grandest courts in the world is as fascinating now as it ever was. Poised, devoted, difficult, and with a temper that would send her children scattering, this is the story of the real Queen Charlotte. Think of the crown of England and a handsome young king dropping from the clouds into Strelitz. The crowds, the multitudes, the millions that are to stare at her, the swarms to kiss her hand, the pomp of the coronation. She needs be but 17 to bear it. Horace Walpole, 4th Earl of Orford to Horace Mann, 17th of August, 1761. The king I think remarkably well, the queen as usual, sometimes sweet and sometimes sour. Princess Amelia to the Prince of Wales, October 1806. Act 1. Princess. No lack of daughters, nor of sons by and by. 8 years hence came the little Charlotte, subsequently Mother of England, much to her and our astonishment. Mother of England. The childhoods of royal daughters do not always make for a happy story. In the Hanoverian family tree alone, one can find children ripped from the arms of their mothers, never to be reunited, sons thrashed for stepping out of line, and daughters locked away, cosseted in perpetual girlhood. For Sophie Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, however, things were rather different. If Great Britain was a superpower, Mecklenburg was anything but. Just 120 miles long and 30 wide, it petered out into the Baltic Sea in the north, and its borders were crowded by Brandenburg, Lüneburg, and Holstein. Mecklenburg had once been a powerful home to the Vandals, but as their dominance decreased, they were pushed further and further back until it was their only stronghold. Here they reinforced their kingdom until they fell beneath the forces of Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony. Duke Henry brought Christianity to the conquered people of Mecklenburg, and hot on his heels followed an influx of new arrivals from Germany and the Low Countries. Once the stronghold of warlords, Mecklenburg was changing beyond recognition. Over centuries, the German territories were reshaped and carved up, used as bargaining chips and dowries in a never-ending European power play. In 1701, the Treaty of Hamburg established the Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a far from important state of the immensely powerful Roman Empire. Mecklenburg was simply one of dozens of duchies that the empire hoovered up to secure its power, but it proved extraordinarily good at producing queens. Sophie Charlotte's father, Duke Charles Louis Frederick of Mecklenburg, was born in Strelitz in 1708. He was the younger son of Adolphus Frederick II, the reigning Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and the half-brother of another Adolphus Frederick, who eventually succeeded their father to rule over the duchy in 1708. Just 3 months old when his father died, young Charles Louis inherited the commanderies of Miro and Nemero. A commandery was the smallest territory anyone could administer, and even in Mecklenburg, where large was relative, it paled in comparison to the lands controlled by Adolphus Frederick III. Charles didn't mind, though. It was all a matter of birthright after all. The infant Charles Louis was taken by his bereaved mother to the family estate at Miro, where he was raised. Miro was a rather sorry place, by far the lesser of the Mecklenburg territories, just as the Strelitz branch of the house was lesser to the others, and Charles Louis's education was rather waning too. Still, he lived the life of a noble young gentleman, eventually leaving Miro for Pomerania and a program of study at the University of Greifswald. The 18-year-old Charles Louis also undertook the requisite grand tour of Europe, a coming-of-age rite of passage for high-born young men. With little calling him home, he entered the military in the service of the Holy Roman Empire, serving to little fanfare before he finally returned to Miro. Upon his return to his childhood home, Charles Louis was ready to settle down. He took as his wife Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Ilberalsen, and though theirs was a marriage of minor dynastic importance for two minor dynastic families, it was one founded on love. Their union seemed to signal a new beginning in Miro, and soon the little court was beginning to flourish. Though far from wealthy, the young couple's presence ignited a spark that revitalized all of the land. Yet as his territories prospered and Charles Louis threw himself into their improvement, his health began to fail. He already suffered from recurrent bouts of pulmonary illness, and as the years passed, they grew ever more serious. Elizabeth Albertine was the daughter of Ernest Frederick I, Duke of Saxe-Ilberausen, and Countess Sophia Albertine of Erbach-Erbach. Like Charles Louis in Miro, their life was hardly illustrious. Ernest Frederick was a soldier who had dreamed of recreating the splendid Bourbon court on his home turf, but instead he managed to wring the treasury dry. With his lands on the brink of revolt, Ernest Frederick tried to raise funds by selling his wife's dowry, the county of Kylenburg. Saxe-Meiningen purchased the county, not realizing that Sophia Albertine hadn't consented to the sale, which she was legally required to do. Once the truth got out, Saxe-Meiningen and Saxe-Ilberhausen entered into a ruinous territorial war that devastated the land. It wasn't until Ernest Frederick's death that the financial situation in Saxe-Ilberhausen came under control. His widow, it turned out, was more of a ruler than he had ever been. It was from this unsettled court that Elizabeth Albertine came to Miro. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the example of her mother, when Elizabeth Albertine was called upon to prove her mettle many years after her marriage, she proved herself more than capable. She and Charles Louis eventually had 10 children, 4 of whom died in infancy. Of the 6 who survived to adulthood, Sophie Charlotte was the longest lived. The seat of every social virtue. Sophie Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was born on the 19th of May 1744 at the Unteres Schloss in Miro. She was the 8th child and 5th daughter, though 3 died in infancy, of the Duke and Duchess, who had passed 9 years of happily married life. There was nothing to suggest that this latest arrival might become a queen, and nothing to suggest that anyone as lofty as the King of Great Britain might ever even know that she existed. When it came to raising their children, Charles Louis and Elizabeth Albertine didn't stand on ceremony. The couple personally oversaw their education under the watchful eye of Reverend Gottlob Burchard Gentmer, a Lutheran minister. Sophie Charlotte and her older sister Christiane were subject to a regime with 2 things at its heart: faith and family. Gentmer was particularly passionate about the sciences, and the little siblings soon shared their tutor's excitement about everything from mineralogy to botany, which was Sophie Charlotte's particular passion throughout her life. Though Gentmer couldn't teach the girls English because he didn't speak it himself, Sophie Charlotte did study French, the language of the courts of Europe, and she proved herself to be a placid and industrious student who was keen to learn. The girls and their brothers studied European literature, history, geography, and a great many classes of arts and sciences. Though botany was always one of Sophie Charlotte's keenest interests, Gentmer also shared with her his enthusiasm for mineralogy. During his research, he had assembled an impressive collection of fossils, which was considered to be one of the best in Europe, and Sophie Charlotte was fascinated by it. In the years to come, Sophie Charlotte's interest in mineralogy never waned, and when queen, she became the patron of Jean-André de Luc, the Swiss geologist and meteorologist. Perhaps we can best see the difference in the fate that awaited the brothers and sisters when we consider that, whilst her brother was appointed rector of the University of Greifswald at the age of just 15 and delivered a self-composed Latin oration on the occasion, Sophie Charlotte was being trained in household management. Not for her the lofty ivory towers of higher education. Instead, she was already well on the way to becoming the very picture of a philanthropic gentlewoman. She excelled in botany, needlework, and music, and undertook regular trips to the poor of the duchy, dispensing charity and taking a real interest in the well-being of those who had less than she. So whilst Sophie Charlotte's brothers were being prepared to serve the duchy, the girls were being prepared to serve as yet unknown husbands. Their progress was monitored by their governess, Mademoiselle Seltzer, a noblewoman from the neighbouring duchy of Württemberg, who had been childhood friends with Elizabeth Albertine. Mademoiselle Seltzer was virtually a member of the family, and she oversaw the more feminine aspects of the girls' education that Gentmer could not. Though she too spoke no English, yet nobody suspected an ability to converse in English would be high on Sophie Charlotte's future agenda. Effectively, Sophie Charlotte's early life resembled that of the landed but not quite moneyed gentry, rather than the mind-bogglingly wealthy. The family revenues were a far from high-rolling £15,000 per year, less than half the annual allowance that one of her sons alone would later receive. But life in Mecklenburg was happy. The mornings were spent in lessons or bent over needlework and embroidery, skills Sophie Charlotte later shared with her own daughters. At the end of the morning, the 2 sisters would be taken for a walk or perhaps a drive before lunch. Then there was music, dancing, and household management to master. Years later, these would prove to be useful skills indeed. It might all sound a little too good to be true, but Charlotte never forgot the unambitious, domesticated court of her youth. When Thomas Nugent, already famed for his extensive multi-volume account of his grand tour, visited Miro, he painted a picture of a land where all was calm, a world away from the politicking court of England. They have no ambition here, but that of serving their prince and country. They idle not away their time, but act with the utmost diligence in their respective departments. They behave with a just dignity and decorum, avoiding the extremes of meanness and pride. They are content with their parental fortunes, which set them above the inordinate desire of riches. They are open and sincere, which renders them lovers of truth. They have no occasion to cringe to a prince whose aversion is flattery. They have the highest ideas of honour, and subsequently are true to their engagements. They have an inviolable regard for all civil duties. They have a love for their prince on account of his virtues, and esteem him for his capacity. To conclude, it may be truly said that instead of encouraging the ridicule of virtue, this court is a pattern of morality and religion, a school of probity and honour, a seminary of politeness, and, in fine, the seat of every social virtue. This, my dear friend, is no exaggeration, but a fair portrait. The court of Strelitz, indeed, is not very numerous, but it is one of the most regular and most agreeable of any in the whole empire. No private family is governed with more order, and perhaps no prince is served by abler officers, and with greater diligence and affection. But this happy idyll wasn't destined to last. The Duke, who had always been a martyr to ill health, died in 1752 at the age of just 44. His death left his family heartbroken, and the newly widowed Elizabeth Albertine came to rely ever more on the friendship of Mademoiselle Seltzer. Perhaps this was the genesis of the female circle that Sophie Charlotte herself later established, when she drew her daughters into a secretive cabal to which few men were admitted. The most regular and most agreeable. Just months after the death of Sophie Charlotte's father, his reigning half-brother, Adolphus Frederick III, followed him to the grave. Because Adolphus Frederick left no male heir, the reigning dukedom descended to the next eligible member of the family, Adolphus Frederick IV, Sophie Charlotte's brother. The new Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was just 14 years old, so Elizabeth Albertine became her son's regent. She packed up her whole household, and the family moved from Miro to the livelier world of Neustrelitz, which had been the capital of Mecklenburg-Strelitz since 1736. For Elizabeth Albertine, however, a change of address didn't mean that other things had to change as well. The domestic and education system that had worked so happily in Miro continued in Neustrelitz, where the little group was joined by Friederike Elisabeth von Grabow, known to her charges as Madame de Grabow. If Mademoiselle Seltzer was the perfect governess for the girls in their youth, as they grew older, Madame de Grabow proved to be an ideal partner in the enterprise. The two women were already friends, and Madame de Grabow enjoyed an excellent reputation as a poet, earning the admiring nickname the German Sappho. She was the daughter of the Mecklenburg minister at Vienna, and had a good marriage which had left her a very rich widow. She fit into the household perfectly, and became a firm favourite of the two princesses, whose love of geography was nurtured by their new governess's talent for cartography. Years later, when Sophie Charlotte was a queen, having played a part in her upbringing, was Madame de Grabow's proudest achievement. Although life in Neustrelitz was more formal than it had been in Miro, Elizabeth Albertine went out of her way to ensure that there was as little disruption as possible to the familiar routine. Elizabeth Albertine was a firm believer in the old adage that the devil finds work for idle hands, and when the girls weren't in lessons, they were expected to indulge in improving pastimes. They never found their lessons a chore, in a large part because of their respect and affection for their tutors. In the years to come, the regime of schooling and self-improvement that had created Sophie Charlotte was very much in evidence for her children too. Unfortunately, they proved a little less receptive to it than she had been. Sophie Charlotte was as sheltered as she had ever been, not yet joining her mother and older siblings when they dined in public. But every Sunday she was allowed to change out of her modest dresses and don her finest gown. She spent the morning in a long church service, then went out to tour the streets in a liveried coach pulled by 6 horses, accompanied by duchy guards. It was a very minor taste of the fame that would follow. This sheltered upbringing was also the basis of the life Sophie Charlotte's own daughters would one day be forced to live. They were kept away from the world for far longer than Sophie Charlotte ever was. The thought that she would eventually become one of the most famous women in Europe was unimaginable. And in a world where pushy mothers were always angling to grab the most prestigious spouse for their offspring that they could, Elizabeth Albertine had no such ambitions. What she wanted for them most of all was the same happiness that she had once known. It was no coincidence that life at her court was like that of a happy upper-middle-class family, because she took pains to ensure that was exactly what she created. Intelligent, affable, and taught to be humble, young Sophie Charlotte absorbed all of this like a sponge. If her mother's adherence to religious faith and humility was rather quaint in modern, forward-looking Germany, it was a fundamental building block in her daughter's personality. Even when she had the splendour of the British court at her fingertips, Sophie Charlotte held fast, sometimes infuriatingly so, to the lessons of piety and humility she had learned in childhood. These were qualities that the siblings seemed to share, and when Sophie Charlotte's brother, Prince Charles Louis, made a tour of the German courts, he received a marriage proposal from an anonymous but illustrious princess. She had all the qualifications that were considered essential in a wife, from pedigree and influence to wealth and beauty. Charles Louis, however, rejected the proposal for one reason. Despite all her attributes, the princess was far too flippant when it came to religion. For the children of Elizabeth Albertine, this was beyond the pale. May it please your Majesty. In many ways, life in Neustrelitz had been too good to last. Elizabeth Albertine had raised her children admirably and had devoted herself to ensuring that they enjoyed a childhood that wasn't only improving, but loving too. Whilst the major European courts were filled with drama and intrigue, in Neustrelitz there was precious little of either. Elizabeth Albertine knew that whilst her court might be happy, it was far from influential or particularly wealthy, so there was little point in hungrily pursuing the most illustrious bridegrooms for her daughters. Though she had proved to be an able regent, and her son was proving to be an able ruler, however, storm clouds were gathering. They would have a shattering effect on the court at Neustrelitz. The first blows of the 7 Years' War were struck in 1756, when the Prussian armies of Frederick the Great invaded Saxony. Frederick had expected to form an alliance with the court of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, but when none came, he turned his armies on the minor territories of the duchy and began to systematically punish them. It was inevitable that Neustrelitz would suffer. Faced with the House of Mecklenburg's determination to remain neutral at all costs, Frederick the Great decided that, if he couldn't count on their support, he would use them in another way. The ducal estates became the pathways along which vast numbers of his troops marched to reach their billets in the towns and villages dotted around the land. Though ostensibly neutral, Mecklenburg found its people and lands were treated with all the hostility that might be afforded to an enemy, and Frederick's troops behaved with all the terrifying might that one would expect of an occupying army. They helped themselves to what they wanted, when they wanted, press-ganged men for the army, and taxed the people with reckless abandon. They took more than their share of food, occupied homes, and smashed up the furniture and belongings they found there to make firewood, leaving the citizens of the duchy starving, cold, and penniless. Though their conduct had supposedly not been ordered by the higher echelons within Prussia, a complete lack of censure or punishment suggested that whatever the troops were doing, they were doing with the blessing of their paymasters. In short, Frederick was punishing the duchy for its neutrality. Eventually, the inevitable happened, and Frederick the Great declared Mecklenburg a military garrison from which his troops would defend Prussian interests against any attempts at incursions from Russia or Sweden. With seemingly no respite on the horizon, Elizabeth Albertine sank into depression. She had the family's valuables packed up and smuggled to Hamburg to protect them from seizure by the Prussian military, but she was determined to stay on. To abandon her marital lands now, at their moment of greatest need, was something that Elizabeth Albertine couldn't countenance. Instead, she redoubled her efforts at philanthropy, but with the contingent plunged into war, what little the Duchess could do was vastly outweighed by the daily torments visited on her subjects. The only hope left was that peace would soon break out, but that possibility seemed scant indeed. Today we're well used to the PR games of celebrities, but it might come as a surprise to learn that in the 18th century things weren't always so different. Long after the Prussian troops had left Mecklenburg and Sophie Charlotte had said "I do" to George III, a letter surfaced that ignited a fresh wave of affection for her. Though she was just a teenager when her ancestral lands fell into deprivation, legend had it that the young princess had penned an impassioned plea to Frederick the Great, begging him to withdraw his soldiers. The letter certainly appears to be straight from someone's heart, but it wasn't Sophie Charlotte's. May it please your Majesty, I am at a loss whether I should congratulate or condole with you on your late victory, since the same success which has covered you with laurels has overspread the country of Mecklenburg with desolation. I know, sire, that it seems unbecoming my sex, in this age of vicious refinement, to feel for one's country, to lament the horrors of war, or to wish for the return of peace. I know you may think it more properly my province to study the arts of pleasing, or to inspect subjects of a more domestic nature. But however unbecoming it may be in me, I cannot resist the desire of interceding for this unhappy people. It was but a very few years ago that this territory wore the most pleasing appearance. The country was cultivated, the peasant looked cheerful, and the towns abounded with riches and festivity. What an alteration, at present, from such a charming scene! I am not expert at describing, nor can my fancy add any horrors to the picture, but surely even conquerors themselves would weep at the prospect now before me. The whole country, my dear country, lies before me one frightful waste, presenting objects to excite terror, pity, and despair. The business of the husbandman and the shepherd are quite discontinued. The husbandman and the shepherd are becoming soldiers themselves, and assist to ravage the soil they formerly cultivated. The towns are inhabited only by old men, women, and children, with perhaps here and there a wounded and crippled warrior, left as useless at his own door. See how his little children come round him, ask the history of every wound, and grow almost soldiers themselves before they have judgment to calculate the distress that war brings upon mankind. But all this might be borne, did we not suffer from the alternate insolence of either army, as it happens to advance or retreat in pursuing the objects of the campaign. It is impossible to express the confusion with which those who even call themselves our friends create, and those from whom we might expect redress, oppress us with new calamities. From your justice, sire, it is therefore that we hope for relief. Even women and children may complain to you, whose humanity stoops to the meanest petition, and whose power is capable of redressing the greatest injustice. I am, sire, etc. Popular gossip after the marriage of Sophie Charlotte and George claimed that the letter had found its way to his mother, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, Dowager Princess of Wales. The Romantics explained that Augusta showed the letter to George II, who showed it to his grandson, who fell in love. Supposedly, rather like Prince Charming and Cinderella Slipper, when George II died and George III succeeded to the throne, he sent an envoy to Europe in search of the princess, with instructions not to rest until he had secured her hand in marriage. Needless to say, that wasn't the case at all. Whoever wrote and circulated the letter, it certainly wasn't a young princess from Mecklenburg-Strelitz. But in the years to come, she would be credited with Frederick the Great's decision to enforce military discipline amongst the troops stationed in Mecklenburg. Regardless of what was truly behind his decision, life in the duchy slowly began to settle down once more.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?